China is formidable, and particularly under a leader like Xi Jinping, it's doubly formidable. And given his surveillance apparatus, it's trebly formidable. The Chinese are highly intelligent, highly disciplined, masters of economic statecraft, and they know where leverage lies. And because their political culture is dominated by a culture of engineers, they understand precisely, instinctively, before you get an elaborate dumbed-down briefing to your average Western cabinet.
And then I would say over the last 2 years, that shifted again. This is my perception of the zeitgeist, to a sense now that China's industrial juggernaut has jumped a series of levels such that it is no longer just copying America, but it can now do things America, to say nothing of the Europeans or others, cannot do. It is nearly level with us in AI, but much more able to build some of the underlying infrastructure of AI, like energy. But its ability to produce electric vehicles, its ability to produce functionally anything because of its manufacturing ecosystems is now actually beyond where we are. And so it was wrong, this sense a few years ago, that the Chinese model is beginning to break down. And in fact, whatever its problems, it has developed perhaps not economic prosperity, but economic power that is very, very real. In some ways, all of these stories seem true to me. And I'm curious how you think about that kind of whiplash that has been happening in the American story of the Chinese economy and its power.
Well, I think, Ezra, you're right to describe that evolution of American perceptions. And American perceptions are not entirely detached from the underpinning Chinese economic reality. Sometimes I worry, though, in this country, where I've lived among you now for the better part of 10 years, sometimes hope becomes a substitute for analysis and strategy in this country, that Americans, or at least those in administrations of one hue or another, look at Chinese demography, they look at the slowing of growth, and they say, yeah, we told you so, problem fixed, and we move on. It ain't fixed. China is formidable, and particularly under a leader like Xi Jinping, it's doubly formidable. And given his surveillance apparatus, it's trebly formidable. I think in terms of the periods you're talking about, yes, post-COVID, growth slowed. But underpinning it all was always this continued red thread of Xi Jinping's core organizing principle, which is, I'm building the world's most powerful industrial state. And I'm not going to let any bunch of private entrepreneurs or consumers get in the road of that. I'm just going to do it. That was made in China 2025. The 10 technology objectives he set for himself in 2015. If you look at the double down in the current 15th five-year plan announced in only...
These are technologies like semiconductors, EVs.
Aeronautics, EVs, batteries. If you look at the list of where they were in 2015, which was nowhere much, and where they were by 2025 at the end of last year, frankly, as an exercise in industrial policy alone, whatever the economic inefficiency may have been in getting there, Xi Jinping regards that as a bit of loose change compared with obtaining the commanding heights of these new driving technologies.
America is keeping Chinese electric vehicles out, not because they're bad cars. It's because they're such good cars. And if they came in here at their cost, they would annihilate the American electric vehicle sector, right? I think this is a change that people have not, for so long our theory was they're copying us or stealing our intellectual property. Now we are quite afraid in some cases of their intellectual property.
I think this has been a big evolution in the reality. Does China engage in industrial espionage? Yes. Does China copy stuff which is obviously available through open patent? Of course. And they have the great advantage of scale, and they scale up. They scale up rapidly given the automatic leverage of their domestic market. But given their domestic market is still flat because of problems with disposable income, then deploying this surplus capacity, this surplus production on global markets is their next best step. And since America has erected the tariff wall, all roads lead to Europe, which is why you see such huge reaction now from European political leaders. That's what's unfolding. And it's all of those things everywhere at once. and at a pace of knots, like this thing is happening at speed now. Is it sustainable for China itself? Ultimately, there is a problem of finance, and we need to think this through. How does China finance this level of industrial subsidy? For them in their calculus, this is a temporary exercise. That is, we will, through our level of industrial subsidy, ultimately destroy the world's competition and opposition. Those will fold. Then we can restore prices at a level which makes sense for us in terms of the cost of production domestically. But by then, the alternative sources of production have gone. This is a very elaborately thought through strategy on the part of the Chinese. And so far, to give them credit, it has worked remarkably well. But they cannot sustain it indefinitely. They're currently borrowing from Chinese consumers and their personal savings in banks to keep this whole thing afloat. But industrial subsidy, which is of an order of magnitude not seen in economic history before, cannot be sustained forever.
So I want to slow this part down because I think it's really important. You were saying earlier, you described the problem, right? The Americans just sort of hope the problem is solved. And what is the problem? How does one define the problem? And we're not always very clear about that. But I think it's something quite close to this, that the challenge China poses to the rest of the world is it is able to suppress domestic prosperity, take money from its own people, keep their wages down, in order to put it into these industries to attain scale, which would functionally make it impossible for other countries to compete in these industries because they will just be too far behind and the Chinese goods will be too much cheaper. I mean, that is the theory in part of the tariffs you saw come out in the Biden administration, and obviously even more in the Trump administration, which is if China is going to make its products artificially cheap, we are going to make them artificially expensive. From that perspective, is that a wise strategy?
It is a perfectly logical response to the challenge which China's industrial policy, which exists on the basis of massive industrial subsidies, poses. The alternative is you simply allow the Chinese industrial juggernaut to dominate every single industrial and sub-industrial sector. We've already seen that in terms of critical minerals and rare earths, both raw and processed. If you want a case study of what that looks like in practice, look at that sector.
Not only did they dominate that, they were so dominant in it that they were able to break Trump's tariff policy, break his trade war by simply threatening to remove our access to their rare earths and magnets and so on. They had leverage over us that we did not have over them.
The Chinese are highly intelligent, highly disciplined, masters of economic statecraft, and they know where leverage lies. And because their political culture is dominated by a culture of engineers, they understand precisely, instinctively, before you get an elaborate dumbed-down briefing to your average Western cabinet about where they stand against the periodic table of critical minerals and rare earths, how many they've got, both on the extraction side and the processing side, and where they therefore will end up to by year X in their ability to, shall we say, exercise leverage elsewhere.
So I think I want to flip the question of what Xi Jinping believes for a minute. We've been talking about what he believes about China. What does he believe about the United States of America and about Donald Trump?
He hasn't told me. So again, we're into the realm of speculation here. But his view of America, let me start with that, and then we'll move on to the president. His view of America is that it's the only country in the world potentially standing in the way of his national, political and economic and geopolitical ambition. Why? Simply because of your scale. And secondly, for 100 years, you guys have represented, since the early days of Dewey liberalism, an alternative script for how you construct the politics of a country. And so when Xi Jinping looks at America, he looks at it through these two lenses. You represent this massive alternative ideational force, the attraction to the idea that still causes many successful Chinese to go and live in the United States and the rest of the collective West, because freedom is not a hackneyed phrase, particularly if you've lived in a country where there is none. But at the level of raw national power, the power of the US military, the power of Indo-Pacific Command, the power of what you have in cyber and space and your nuclear forces, and the power of American innovation reflected through Silicon Valley cubed, he looks at that and says, that's the only thing that can get in my road. And that's why America occupies this unique position, whether you're run by Republicans or whether you're run by Democrats.
We've talked about how Xi Jinping has a dialectical, historical view of China's rise and communism's rise. Does that extend to a similarly inevitabilist view of American decline? Does the Chinese Communist Party, does its sort of mainstream of thought believe America to be in a kind of structural decline?
They do have this belief, and it's expressed in two different ways. There is a Chinese concept of what they call comprehensive national power. It's a standard analytical framework for aggregate American power v. aggregate Chinese power against all indices of power. They look at the size of the US military, the size of allied militaries, the size of their own military, and they make their own calculus. They also make calculus about the solidity of, shall we say, US alliances abroad, and when those are under pressure or when they're beginning to fracture. They also look at the solidity of the US domestic body politic and the degree of unity and disunity against, shall we say, the predetermined unity of the Chinese unitary state. Interestingly, they stopped publishing this stuff for the rest of the world to see what their conclusions were about 12 years ago, I think because the results were beginning to look increasingly indicative that China was really rising rather rapidly. The second is in a propagandistic phrase, which is in Chinese, it's Dongsheng Xijiang, which is the rise of the East and the decline of the West. And in Chinese political parlance, that's a euphemism for China and the United States. And if there's a third phrase, it's probably Xi Jinping's oft-used phrase, including during the summit with President Trump most recently. The world is now experiencing changes not seen in 100 years. He first began using that phrase in 2017 on the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. And the internal interpretation of the phrase is that we, the Chinese, now with our own revolution, now going out into the world at large, represent as seminal shaking an event of the certainties and certitudes of global politics today as the Bolshevik Revolution portended back in 1917.
And so then there's, I guess, two things here. One is that in the time Xi Jinping has been leader, American policy towards China, American political elite thinking towards China has changed dramatically. It's become far more antagonistic. The sense that China would become more liberal and democratic as it became richer has dissolved. The sense that we allowed China to take advantage of us has become a bipartisan theory, and that we are locked in a great competition with them. Possibly a Thucydides trap leading to war has become fairly widely believed and certainly widely prepared for. And of course, American politics itself has changed, falling into this period of Trumpism and much more internal division. I mean, you read a book called The Avoidable War that was at least partly about this.
Yeah.
What is their narrative of us in this era?
They saw a sea change just under 10 years ago, and during the first Trump administration, when the official American strategy towards China changed from strategic engagement to strategic competition. H.R. McMaster, then Trump's national security advisor, wrote that in the national security strategy, I think December of 2017. And that wasn't just a piece of language. You could almost hear the creaking of the entire machinery of the US state across all agencies of power.
Before that, Obama talked about his pivot to Asia.
That's true. But he did not have an organizing principle, which is that we are in a competitive relationship with China about which country becomes the dominant power in the Indo-Pacific and in the world. So that's the big change. That dominated second half of Trump's term, first term, dominated really Biden administration, and then through until the most recently convened summit in Beijing, where we now have a different organizing principle announced for the first time, this time by the Chinese, called constructive strategic stability. And the White House briefing paper, which came back at the conclusion of the visit, said, yeah, that's the framework we accept so long as it's fair and reciprocal. So what does that mean if you decode it? I think what the Chinese are seeking to do is to cause the United States to be more stable, less unpredictable, and less antagonistic going forward. What is it going to mean in practice? I don't know. One of the advantages may be the two sides begin to have an active and substantive negotiation on the regulation of the most dangerous and destabilizing forms of artificial intelligence, which is what came out of Scott Bessent's conversations with his counterpart, He Lifeng. For the rest of the relationship beyond AI governance, I'm not sure yet.
I find policy towards China, the U.S. orientation to China, to be one of maybe the most major area of U.S. policy where my own thoughts are most unsettled. There's one story that I think has become a more popular story, and I think you could extract it out of at least part of our conversation, which is to say Xi Jinping and the CCP under him are highly ideological organizations and individuals bent on eventually attaining Chinese supremacy, particularly economically and industrially. And you need to understand the relationship as having a competition and an antagonism at its heart. You can manage that better and worse. You can manage it more erratically or more systematically. Right? The Biden administration, I think, was trying to do it very systematically, build up American industries, impose very targeted tariffs, boundary certain kinds of technologies. The Trump administration, I think, has managed it more erratically. But fundamentally, openness towards China in this telling is very dangerous. You don't want their technologies here. You don't want their industries with too much penetration here. And you are trying to compete with them, not learn from them. It's another argument that, in partly for me, I get nervous whenever anything becomes too bipartisan in Washington that says, this is a mistake. You actually need to learn right now from things like Chinese EV manufacturers. You want technology exchanges. You want to understand their manufacturing systems. You don't want to make antagonism self-fulfilling. You don't want to create a lot of room for misinterpretation. There are advantages economically and otherwise that the openness creates. That the shift towards seeing it as fundamentally opposed is actually missing a lot of positive sum opportunities in trade, innovation. If China, they have a lot of actually really interesting bio research coming out. If they invent new medications, that's wonderful for us. Where do you fall on this spectrum?
The third way. And let me explain what I mean by that. One, as I've said before, don't mistake the fundamentals here, which is that Xi Jinping and the party he leads is Leninist. And they have a very clear-eyed view of where they wish to be at home and abroad. And at home and abroad, it's for China to become a fully developed economy, and abroad for China to be the most powerful state in the Indo-Pacific region and in the world, and to surpass the United States. So let's just be clear about that. It's an unemotional, clear-headed, realist, but ideologically driven view of the world. What I've argued for a long period of time, and I think there are levels of agreement and disagreement with this approach, is what I call managed strategic competition. Accept the reality of the competition and manage it. It's far better than unmanaged strategic competition, which can end in crisis, conflict, and war. What do I mean by that? 3 points, really. Accept the fact that there are fundamental strategic red lines which they can't cross and we can't cross. and that managing those red lines, particularly over the question of Taiwan, the South China Sea and the East China Sea, is the meat and potatoes of sustained deterrence, and that actually creates the strategic stability for the rest of the management of the relationship to ensue. The second element of managed strategic competition is, for the economy writ large, whether it's trade, investment, capital markets, currency markets, technology markets, talent markets, ideas markets, the ideation of the future, the liberal international rules-based order or one headquartered in Beijing, make this a full and open competition and may the best system win. The third component of managed strategic competition is those areas which we define as in our mutual interest to cooperate on. Future of AI governance, ? Preventing the next global pandemic, given how much we all screwed up on the last one, particularly the Chinese. The future of other forms of global public health, like cancer research and biotech. And these are quite rich areas for collaboration. And my view is we can walk and chew gum at the same time in these three different domains, while recognizing that we're not ultimately engaged with those organizing a Sunday school picnic.